5 things that happen when you truly put God first. There's a simple truth most people never say plainly. When you truly put God first in your life, not in theory, not in words, but in how you actually live, everything begins to change in ways you never expected. Not because you tried harder, not because you became more disciplined, but because the order of your heart shifted. And in that surrender, God begins to move. Over the years, I've sat with many people, good people who come to me with tired eyes and heavy questions. They'll say they believe in God, they pray, they go to church, but inside they still feel lost. They don't feel peace. Something's unsettled. And more than once I've heard them whisper, "Why doesn't my Christian life look like what I hoped it would?" And I rarely answer that question right away. Instead, I gently ask, in everything you're doing right now, is there anything truly where God is first? Not just in theory, but in how you choose, how you think, how you spend your time, what you protect, and what you fear losing the most. Usually, the answer comes through silence, because the truth is, many believers walk with God in the background of their lives. He's present, yes, but not central. He's invited into the house, but asked to stay in the guest room. He becomes a comforting idea, not the driving reality. And the hard part is, when God isn't first, the fullness of what He wants to do in us often gets blocked, not because He is weak, but because we've placed Him in a position He never agreed to take. Second, third, or somewhere in the mix. Now, I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. I say it to invite you to sit with me for a moment and reflect on something vital. What really happens when someone begins to place God first? Not once, not in one area, but truly across the whole of life. If you felt stuck in your faith, spinning your wheels and not knowing why you still feel empty, maybe what you need isn't another activity or spiritual tip. Maybe what you need is a shift in position, putting God where He belongs. And when that happens, you won't be the same. So let me tell you what actually begins to change when God is no longer part of your life, but becomes the center of it. Part 1. Your priorities begin to shift. Putting God first doesn't usually come with fireworks. It often begins quietly, almost unnoticed, in the background of an ordinary life. But as subtle as it may seem at first, the shift it causes is deep and lasting. One of the first signs is that your priorities, what you value, chase, protect, begin to change. You may not even notice it immediately. You still wake up to the same responsibilities, still go to work, still interact with the same people. But inside, something feels different. Your heart starts tugging in new directions. The things that used to matter most, status, success, security, approval, start to loosen their hold on you, not because you stopped caring altogether, but because something greater has taken the central place. And that something is not an idea, it's a person. I remember a woman I counseled years ago. She had grown up in church, raised her children in faith, and faithfully served in the background for decades. But she came to me one day, tears quietly falling, and said, "I've loved God all my life, but I don't think I ever made Him first. I always fit Him in around everything else." She wasn't angry. She wasn't even ashamed. She was just waking up to a truth that had waited patiently in her soul for years. And from that point on, she began reordering things, not all at once, but in real, deliberate ways. Putting God first doesn't mean quitting your job or selling everything and moving to a village. It means asking, every single day, what does God value most in this situation? It means letting His wisdom, not the world's logic, shape your calendar, your tone of voice, your financial decisions, and even how you rest. You begin to see time differently, not as something you control, but something you're entrusted with. And time is usually where the first shift happens. People who put God first begin to feel uncomfortable wasting hours on things that leave their soul empty. They stop filling silence with endless noise. They find themselves longing to spend time in prayer, not because it earns them points with God, but because something in them needs it, like a plant needs light. Then comes a shift in relationships. You might find yourself distancing from voices that constantly stir anxiety or distraction, not out of pride, but because you've realized some relationships pull you away from peace instead of toward it, and you no longer have the appetite to constantly prove yourself to people who can never be satisfied. Eventually, even the way you handle conflict changes. When God is first, you're not as quick to defend your ego. You're slower to retaliate, quicker to forgive. You start asking not, how can I win this argument, but how can I honor God in this moment? That doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become anchored. Even your idea of success transforms. You may still work hard, still pursue excellence, but now success isn't about being seen. It's about being faithful. You no longer measure your days by how much you accomplished, but by whether you stayed in step with God's Spirit. That quiet change brings rest, not because life gets easier, but because your soul is no longer pulled in a dozen directions. You've chosen your center, and that center holds. There's also a deep humility that grows in you. When God is first, you begin to let go of the illusion of control. You stop trying to manage every outcome. You start trusting that the God who leads you is also the God who provides for you, defends you, and opens the right doors in His time. None of this means the rest of your life disappears. You'll still pay bills, still face hard decisions, still deal with disappointment. But now, you're not making those decisions from fear. You're making them from faith. Because when your life is built around God, not just flavored with Him, you stop asking, what do I want to do? And start asking, what is God already doing? And how do I join Him in it? And when you start living that way, when your default question in life is God, what would honor you most? You'll find a strange thing happens. You begin to gain clarity. Decisions feel less frantic. You don't rush as much. You wait better. You listen more. You breathe deeper. Not because you've mastered life, but because the Master now leads it. That's the first thing that happens when God truly becomes first. The compass of your life shifts, and little by little, the rest of your life follows that new direction. Part 2. You begin to desire what God desires. At first, your desires don't suddenly vanish or turn holy overnight. You still want what you've always wanted: comfort, success, security, love, approval. These longings are familiar, deeply human, and truthfully, some of them are not wrong. But as God takes first place in your life, something in you begins to shift. You don't force it. It's not about guilt or fear. It's quieter than that. It's like waking up one day and realizing the taste of your old habits doesn't satisfy anymore. You might catch yourself pausing before a purchase you would have made without thinking. You might turn off a show that used to entertain you, but now stirs something unsettled in your spirit. You begin to notice how much noise you used to tolerate, and how hungry you've become for stillness. These aren't grand gestures. They're small, sacred turns of the heart, and they matter. One woman once told me, I used to pray for a husband, a house, and a better job. But now, I just pray to want what God wants, because every time I get what I want without Him, I end up more anxious, not less. That realization didn't come in a single moment. It came after years of chasing her own dreams, then wondering why her joy always faded. She had confused blessings with alignment, and when she began asking, God, what do you want in this situation? She started to experience a peace that success had never brought her. Desiring what God desires doesn't erase your personality or passions. It sharpens them. It gives them purpose. Maybe you love music. Maybe you're drawn to business or teaching or writing. Putting God first doesn't mean abandoning those things. It means surrendering them, asking God, how can this reflect your heart? Not just my talent. And suddenly, the work of your hands carries eternal weight. It's not just about talents either. Even your reactions begin to shift. You get less pleasure from gossip, even if you once found it entertaining. You feel a tug in your conscience when you speak harshly. You're more tender toward people you used to judge. Why? Because your heart is slowly learning what God values: mercy, truth, justice, humility. And once you begin to see people through His eyes, it's hard to go back. I remember a man in his 70s who spent decades living for himself. Late in life, he surrendered to Christ. And I'll never forget what he said to me. I don't regret what I missed out on. I regret not caring about what God cares about sooner. He began volunteering with at-risk youth, not because it made him feel good, but because he genuinely wanted to show someone the love he never received as a child. His desires were no longer about comfort. They were about redemption. Your prayers also begin to change. You stop trying to control every outcome. You stop handing God lists and start asking Him to change your heart. You say things like, Lord, shape my will to match yours, and you mean it. Sometimes that means letting go of dreams that once defined you. Sometimes it means staying faithful in places you once wanted to escape. But strangely, the more you surrender, the lighter your soul feels. Even your idea of what a blessed life looks like begins to evolve. You start caring less about how things appear and more about how they align. A quiet, steady day can feel more fulfilling than a packed one. You find beauty in simplicity, joy in obedience, strength in waiting, because now your soul isn't chasing emotional highs, it's resting in divine rhythm. You begin to notice people differently too. You feel drawn to the lonely. You weep more easily when you see injustice. You start praying for people you used to ignore, not because someone told you to, but because something in you aches for what God aches for. His burdens become your burdens. His longings become your compass. This isn't a formula. It's not about trying to behave better or look more spiritual. It's about the Spirit of God slowly, gently transforming your inner life. He begins to prune what's distracting. He deepens what's eternal. And your desires begin to point in a new direction, not toward your own kingdom, but toward His. So if you've ever wondered what's wrong with you because you don't want the right things yet, take heart. You're not broken. You're being reshaped. And as you continue to put God first, what matters to Him will begin to matter to you, not because you forced it, but because your heart is learning how to love in a new way. And when that happens, when you begin to desire what God desires, life no longer feels like a competition or a hustle. It begins to feel like a calling. And in that calling you find joy that circumstances can't touch. Part 3. You start living with eternal perspective. When God becomes first in your life, something happens to the way you view time. It's almost like a second lens gets placed over your eyes. Not one that distorts reality, but one that clarifies what's truly lasting. You begin to see life, not just in days or decades, but in eternity. And once you see from that perspective, you can't unsee it. You start asking different questions. Instead of, what will make me happiest right now? You begin to ask, what will matter in the light of eternity? That shift isn't always dramatic, but it's steady. You might pause before reacting in anger, not just to keep the peace, but because you're learning that words carry eternal weight. You forgive more quickly, not because it's easy, but because eternity reminds you that bitterness is too costly to carry. There's a story I often think about, one I heard from a retired missionary. He and his wife had given up a comfortable life to serve in a remote part of Africa. For over 30 years, when they returned to the U.S., they flew home on the same plane as a famous politician. At the airport, crowds had gathered to welcome the politician. Cameras flashing, cheers filling the room. But for the missionary couple, there was no one, no sign, no crowd, no welcome. He admitted he felt a pang of sadness, but then his wife gently whispered, "We're not home yet." That sentence has stayed with me, because that's what it feels like when you live with eternity in mind. You stop expecting the rewards of this world to satisfy you. You stop demanding that everyone notice your sacrifices. You realize this life isn't the finish line, it's the planting ground. Living with eternal perspective doesn't make you distant from the present. It makes you more engaged, more intentional. You begin to treasure people over possessions, conversations over accomplishments. You begin to see your home, your job, your time as tools, temporary but sacred, through which the love of Christ can be poured into others. You worry less about getting ahead, and you think more about leaving something behind. Not a legacy of applause, but a legacy of faith. What values are you passing on? What stories will your children or grandchildren tell about how you handled hardship or how you treated the forgotten? This shift also softens your grip on control, because eternal perspective reminds you you're not the author of the story. You're a page in something much greater. And because of that, you can live with a little more surrender. You trust that what feels unseen now is not unseen by God. The kindness no one acknowledged. The obedience no one praised. The prayers no one heard but Him. They all count. Even how you suffer changes. When your eyes are fixed on eternity, you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "How is God shaping me through this?" You begin to see pain not as punishment, but as preparation. Trials become teachers, and heaven starts to feel less like a distant hope, and more like the ultimate home you're walking toward. Some people might call this foolish. They'll say you're too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. But the truth is, it's the opposite. The people who live with eternity in their hearts often love the most generously, serve the most quietly, and endure the most faithfully, because they're not just living for now, they're living for forever. And here's the beautiful part. When you live with eternal perspective, you don't fear aging. You don't dread the end, because you know this is not the whole story. This is just the beginning. And every act of faithfulness here echoes in a kingdom that has no end. That's what happens when you truly put God first. You start measuring your life by eternal truths, not temporary trends. You walk a little slower, speak a little gentler, and love a little deeper, not because you've figured it all out, but because your eyes have been lifted from the ground to something far greater than this world can offer. Part 4. You learn to trust God's timing over your own. When God takes first place in your life, it's not just your desires or your vision that changes. Your sense of time changes too. You begin to learn that God rarely works according to your schedule, but He's never late, and that realization changes everything. At first it can feel frustrating. You pray for healing, but it doesn't come right away. You ask for a breakthrough, but the door stays shut. You're doing your best to stay faithful, yet nothing seems to move. In those moments, it's tempting to think God is distant or uninterested. But as your faith deepens, you start to recognize something else. God is not in a hurry because His plans are wiser than your deadlines. There's a kind of maturity that comes only from waiting. And when God is first in your life, you begin to trust that delay doesn't mean denial. It means development. You begin to see that the waiting season is not wasted time. It's shaping time. God is preparing something in you before he does something through you. I've sat with many people over the years, faithful men and women who were once bitter about how long it took for something to happen. But years later, they would look back and say, if God had given me what I asked for when I wanted it, I wouldn't have been ready. There's humility in those words, and gratitude too, because they learned that God's timing wasn't cruel, it was perfect. You also begin to notice that the things you once rushed toward no longer hold the same urgency. You stop comparing your timeline to someone else's. You stop asking, why not me? And start praying, Lord, make me ready. You realize that God's blessings come with God's pace, and when you rush ahead of him, even a good thing can become a burden. This shift doesn't make waiting easy, but it makes it holy. It turns your frustration into formation. And the more you surrender your timeline, the more peace you experience. You begin to understand verses like Ecclesiastes 3:11, which says, he has made everything beautiful in its time, not your time, his. Sometimes God delays an answer so your faith can deepen. Sometimes he waits to protect you from something you can't yet see. And sometimes he simply wants to walk with you longer before revealing what's next. When you put God first, you learn to value that walk as much as the destination. You also start seeing time differently in your relationships. You become more patient with others. You stop forcing people to grow on your schedule. You give them space to struggle, to repent, to heal. Why? Because you've experienced that grace yourself. You know what it's like for God to take his time with you, so you stop demanding instant results from others. This kind of trust doesn't happen overnight. It's forged in silence, in seasons where nothing seems to move. But if you've ever walked through a long night with God, if you've waited and prayed and stayed faithful when no one else saw, you know how deeply that trust takes root. It's not loud. It doesn't always look strong, but it endures because it's anchored in a God who never forgets you. And here's the quiet miracle. When you trust God's timing, you're no longer a slave to urgency. You don't live in panic or pressure. You live in peace. You begin to believe that even when life seems slow or stuck, God is working behind the scenes. He's not just preparing the answer, he's preparing you. So if you're in a season of waiting, don't rush to escape it. Sit with it, talk to God in it, ask him what he's shaping in you, not just what he's withholding from you. Because putting God first means trusting his wisdom, even when you don't understand his calendar. And in the end, you'll look back and realize the delay wasn't punishment. It was protection. It wasn't rejection. It was preparation. And it wasn't silence. It was love, speaking in a slower, deeper language than you expected, but exactly the one your soul needed. Part 5. You become a channel of God's peace to others. One of the most surprising things that happens when God becomes first in your life is this: people around you begin to feel it. Even if they don't understand it, they may not know what changed. They may not know when it started. But they sense it. You carry something different, a kind of peace that doesn't match your circumstances. A presence that's not centered on yourself, a way of responding that calms instead of reacts. It's not because you've figured everything out. It's because God has taken his rightful place in your soul. And when he does, he brings peace with him. This peace doesn't mean you stop feeling pain or pressure. It doesn't mean you never cry or get angry. But there's a steadiness now, a spiritual rootedness. When others panic, you pause. When others judge, you pray. When others withdraw, you reach out, and people start to come to you. Not because you have all the answers, but because being near you feels safe, not emotionally safe. Though that's part of it, spiritually safe. Like something about your presence reminds them that God is near. This kind of peace is not your doing. It's not a personality trait. It's not a temperament you inherited. It's fruit. The fruit of the Spirit, as Galatians 5 says, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. You're not forcing it. You're not pretending. You're simply staying connected to the one who is peace, and that connection starts spilling out in your relationships. You notice it when someone wrongs you, and you don't immediately retaliate. You feel it when a family member is venting, and you resist the urge to fix them. Instead, you listen. You sense it when someone else's anxiety rises, and instead of absorbing it, you ground yourself in prayer. These moments used to overwhelm you, but now you handle them differently. Not perfectly, but prayerfully. I remember visiting an older couple in their 80s, faithful believers, quiet people, not the kind to make a show of their faith, but their home carried peace. You could feel it when you walked in. No loud declarations, no signs on every wall, just gentleness, calm, and a quiet sense that they had walked with God for many years. They didn't talk about peace, they carried it. That's what happens when God becomes first. Peace stops being something you chase and becomes something you give. And the amazing thing is, you start bringing that peace into places where it's in short supply. A chaotic workplace, a tense family gathering, a hurting church. You don't come in with answers or sermons. You come in with presence. You bring a sense of God's nearness, not because you're perfect, but because He's present in you. Even your words change. You speak less to impress and more to bless. You listen more than you lecture. You start to see that sometimes silence is the most powerful witness of all, especially when it's filled with love. There's a verse in Isaiah that says, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." That's not a promise for people with easy lives. It's a promise for people who choose to trust, even when life is hard. And when you live that trust, you become a steady place for others in the storm. This kind of peace doesn't always make you popular. It might confuse people who expect drama. It might frustrate people who want you to take sides. But your loyalty isn't to conflict. It's to Christ. And He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." That's who you're becoming. A peacemaker, not by avoiding truth, not by hiding pain, but by inviting God into the middle of it all, and letting His presence shape your response. And as you do, you'll notice something strange and beautiful. People will start opening up around you, not because you demand it, but because your peace gives them permission to rest, to breathe, to hope. That's what it means to put God first. Not just that you get peace, but that you become a vessel of it. You don't walk into rooms demanding attention. You walk in carrying God's compassion. You become someone who reflects the steadiness of Christ, even in the chaos of this world. And people will remember that, not the clever things you said, but the way they felt when they were near you. That's the legacy of peace, and it always begins with a surrendered heart. Conclusion: this is the kind of life that changes everything. When we talk about putting God first, it's easy for it to sound like a slogan, something we nod at in church, something we write on a sticky note and place on the fridge. But it's far more than that. It's a daily, quiet, courageous decision to let God lead in every area of your life, even the ones you used to guard most tightly. It's choosing surrender over control, trust over anxiety, His wisdom over your instincts, His purpose over your preferences. And that choice, made over and over, sometimes in trembling faith, transforms everything. You begin to see yourself differently. You stop measuring your worth by your past or by people's opinions. You start to believe that the God who created the stars also thought the world needed one of you, that you weren't just saved for heaven, but shaped for a purpose here, that your story, with all its broken pieces and quiet victories, is a testimony in progress. You begin to see others differently too, not as problems to avoid or people to fix, but as souls God longs to reach through you. Your heart softens, your eyes see more, you forgive quicker, you listen deeper. You start becoming a person others trust, not because you have a perfect life, but because you carry peace and walk in love. You also begin to handle pain differently. You no longer ask only, "How do I escape this?" but "How is God refining me through this?" You begin to see trials not just as battles, but as sacred places where God meets you, shapes you, and prepares you for deeper joy. And over time you begin to notice a shift. You're no longer just believing in God, you're walking with Him, talking to Him, depending on Him. Not only in crisis, but in the quiet. Your faith isn't just what you do, it's who you are. And the more you live that way, the more freedom you feel. You stop living under the weight of constant striving. You stop chasing applause or perfection. Instead, you begin living with an open hand, willing to be used, willing to be changed, willing to wait, because you trust the one who holds your life, and you believe He is good. And this is where everything begins to change, because a life that truly puts God first is a life that bears fruit in every season. Maybe not always visible, maybe not always fast, but always real, always growing, always drawing others to the light of Christ. Not by shouting, but by shining. So wherever you are right now, whether you're just starting to seek God again, or you've walked with Him for years, know this: it's not too late to reorder your life. It's not too late to choose a different first, to step off the treadmill of self-effort and step into the peace of surrender, to take the hand of the one who has never stopped loving you, and to say, "God, I want you to lead." And when you do that, when you truly put God first, you'll never be the same, because He will meet you right where you are and lead you exactly where you're meant to go.